Cuba, 1996. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, Cuba was having a hard time keeping themselves afloat. There were shortages from everything, from food to fuel, and the tightening of embargoes from the United States wasn't helping. But out of this country in turmoil came an album that changed music as we know it. Our story begins in America, with a man named Ry Cooder. He made known from his various movie soundtracks, including Paris, Texas, or maybe his collaboration with 3 Rolling Stones members on Jammin' with the Edward. He's a guitarist, and he was invited to Cuba by a British man who owned a music label named World Circuit Records by the name of Nick Gold. His plan was to get musicians from Mali to collaborate with musicians from Cuba to create an album of Afro-Cuban music. Cooder accepted the invite and traveled to Cuba, though perhaps through fate, the Mali musicians didn't arrive. Upon this news, the duo changed course and decided to use the local music scene to their advantage and create an album of son music, a blend of Spanish and African music, developed in Cuba in the late 1800s. They already had some locals part of the project. Orlando Lopez, an extremely experienced bassist working with many different genres and groups throughout his career, Eliade Sochoa, a Cuban folk band leader, guitarist, and singer, and the project's musical director, Juan de Marcos Gonzalez, who was really the mastermind behind the music. He had all along envisioned an album of some of the greatest Cuban musicians reviving the golden era of Cuban music. They needed more, though, and they found Ruben Gonzalez, who had retired in the 80s, but who brought back his revolutionary piano playing for this album, Manuel Isea, a vocalist famous in Havana, and Compe Segundo, who was a massive innovator on the Cuban music scene, and also knew how to keep a healthy sense of tradition. These were some of the most prolific. They had a huge set of Cuban musicians after their search. Recording took place in a vintage RCA studio, which was owned by the most important label in Cuba, EGREM. Cooder couldn't speak any Spanish and communicated through an interpreter, although he said the musicians didn't need words to communicate. The album took only 6 days to record and featured 14 songs of Cuban stories, classic boleros and songs, and a massive feeling of experience and collaboration. So far, it sold over 8 million copies and won a Grammy in 1998. All of this without any advertising other than word of mouth, which proved to be highly successful. Remember Ry Cooder? Well, after he got back into the U.S., he began to work with his frequent collaborator, Wim Wenders, on a soundtrack for the movie The End of Violence. Cooder ended up showing Wenders the tapes of the sessions in Cuba, and he was enthusiastic about filming a documentary about the band. He flew down to Cuba to film footage and interviews with the members, as well as went with them on tour in Amsterdam and Carnegie Hall. The film was released on September 17, 1999, and had a successful box office run, grossing $23 million worldwide. It ended up being nominated for an Academy Award and won the European Film Award for the Best Documentary. Buena Vista Social Club is an album of lush and loving grooves, quick, polished guitar, and an exuding sense of mellow friendship across all borders. This album exudes a sense of happiness and comfort that is yet to be replicated to nearly the same extent. Every song builds layer after layer of beautiful, warm music that captivates your senses and demands your attention. I can describe it all I want, but the only way to truly understand this album is to listen to it. If you can only listen to one album of Cuban music, make this the one.
Te tengo, no te lo puedo